Please be seated. I hereby open the meeting.
Madam Rector? Wait,
No,
not yet.
Mr. Gadulhakov, I bid you welcome. Dear candidate, dear committee, dear family and friends, colleagues, I would like to welcome you to the defense of Mr. Rashid Gadulhakov. My name is Martine van Selm and I am Dean of the Erasmus School of History, Culture and Communication. And on behalf of the rector, I'm chairing the graduation committee. Please allow me to introduce the promoter of Mr. Gadulhakov, Professor Susanne Jansen, Professor of Sociology of Media and Culture, Erasmus School of History, Culture and Communication, and also co-promoter Dr. Daniel Trottier, Associate Professor in the Department of Media and Communication of the same school. Mr. Gadulhakov, I bid you welcome, and you are appearing before the committee appointed by the Doctorate Board of the Erasmus University of Rotterdam to defend your thesis and your prepared propositions. Before we start the discussion, I invite you to give a short introduction in which you tell us about the subject and the aims of your studies and your findings.
Madam Rector, thank you for this welcome. Dear committee members, dear colleagues, friends, family members who cannot be here physically but are watching online, paronyms, thank you so much for being here at my PhD dissertation defense. It is quite challenging to summarize 4 years of research in 15 minutes. But I would like to start by asking you to please imagine. Imagine a world where there is no police. There are no courts, no due processes, and no prisons. Instead, you are judged by fellow citizens, by your co-workers. The punitive measures are shame, public shaming. While this may sound like a plot for another Netflix series, in fact, this is anything but fiction, and such cases take place across socio-political and socio-cultural contexts globally and have historically taken place. We refer in this research, which is part of a greater project on digital vigilantism, we refer to this phenomenon as such, digital vigilantism, cases where citizens weaponize social media to retaliate on other citizens over perceived offenses, such as the breaching of moral or legal boundaries. Perhaps you left a garbage bag next to the dumpster instead of putting it in, for whatever reason. Somebody might take a picture of that and put it online. Before you know it, you are shamed in front of your coworkers, your friends, family, and colleagues. Undoing the damage is quite challenging. So with this in mind, let me introduce some of the questions that we raised in the context of Russia. Russia presents a unique case, in my view, because it has a history, a vivid history of delegating justice matters into the hands of citizens. With this in mind, the overarching research question that I raised in this PhD project was how are practices of digital vigilantism in Russia manifested through state-citizen and citizen-to-citizen relations? In order to answer this question, I needed some sub-questions. Let me introduce them as well. First of all, I wanted to look at the historical premises. How is digital vigilantism in Russia informed by historical cases of outsourcing, crowdsourcing, and volunteered citizen-led justice? I also wanted to look at the nuances of weaponization of visibility by participants. I considered motives, what motivates people to engage in such activities, but also what motivates the state to support certain digital vigilantes. I looked at the role of traditional media in rendering digital vigilantism meaningful, looked at how cases that are picked up by broadcasters in this case represent the phenomenon. How is digital vigilantism experienced by targets amid the inequalities, digital divides, and social frustrations and biases? And finally, I looked at the environment, the various milieus in which digital vigilantism takes place in Russia from the perspective of legal environment, but also the media landscape. So let me introduce some findings, and I'm really grateful to Tatiana Zelenskaya for providing illustrations for these dissertations, which I will rely upon for the most part, but some pictures will also be used. The dissertation opens up with a consideration of historical premises. So digital vigilantism had its conventional predecessor in the context of Russia, the so-called comrades courts. As you can see in a photograph here, this is an example of a typical comrade court where at the square in the apartment complex, there is the person who is being accused of some kind of minor mischief, be it alcoholism or slacking at work. We see that the judges are fellow citizens, but they collaborate with police. We also see the audience here comprised of, well, the elderly and children. Having looked at some of the historical accounts of such courts, it became evident that people much rather preferred to be judged in a legal court of justice rather than by fellow colleagues and neighbors, because they would never see the judge again, potentially. But when it comes to living next to the people who shamed you, it becomes quite difficult. We see a modern incarnation of that in Russia, and I will just provide a couple of examples. One of the groups that I considered within this project is called Hrushi Protiv, or Piggy Against. The group finds offense in unscrupulous merchants. They raid the shelves of grocery stores, look for expired produce, and expose allegedly unscrupulous merchants on YouTube. They have their logos, they have shops, and they're a quite recognizable brand. YouTube videos are viewed by millions of viewers. Another group that is part of this research is called Stop Ham or Stop a Douchebag. And this group finds offense in bad parking. They use this sticker that says, "I don't care about anyone, I park where I want," that they put on the windshield of the offenders. Usually, this escalates into verbal and physical violence. Everything is filmed, edited, and uploaded on YouTube. Again, a case where millions of viewers are attracted to this media product. And if you parked in the wrong place and were approached by police, chances are you would get a ticket and go about with your life. But when your offense is filmed and put on YouTube, people have lost their jobs consequently, and so on. What I also observed is that these particular groups, these two groups, the Piggies and the Stop a Douchebag, are endorsed by the state, both formally and informally. They have received state grants, so money for their operations. And they have also taken selfies with state leadership, as we can see here in these images. So some of the conclusions from this is that digital vigilantism in contemporary post-communist Russia is systematic, it is institutionalized. Indeed, it resembles some Soviet practices of citizen-led justice, but new media, digital media brought about new affordances when it comes to monetization, when it comes to the amount of views that you can generate, and when it comes to some of the motives. Unlike Soviet comrades courts, digital vigilante groups in post-communist Russia take offense in a wider range of offenses. There are numerous other examples that some colleagues are also investigating. You can be, for smoking and drinking in public space, you can also be shamed, for example. Motives for engagement are wide, from ideological to religious or financial, among others. And if in the Soviet comrades courts, this role of a judge was entrusted to well-seasoned members of the society, respected members of the society, nowadays the process is a bit reversed. You can become respected by virtue of engaging in these activities. Having done that, I decided to look at the actual videos that are produced by vigilante groups and perform the content analysis over select YouTube videos produced by Piggy Against. What this research revealed was that in Russia and elsewhere, because like I mentioned, the group is a brand and is present across various, in different countries. Stop a Douchebag is present as far as Lima, Peru, for example. In Russia and elsewhere, digital vigilantism is practiced and perceived as a form of entertainment akin to reality TV show. Each episode is carefully fabricated with music and viewer-attracting strategies, such as even featuring celebrities. Vigilantes constitute a reflection of on-the-ground frustrations. Topics that are picked up are actually sort of hot, and they trigger emotions in the viewers. Parking, it's hard in a city like Moscow, St. Petersburg, in other major cities across Russia. Expired produce is actually a problem. But this sort of retaliation is turning into a spectacle of punishment in Foucauldian terms. YouTube videos of such nature are arguably beneficial for the elites, and I would be happy to unpack this in the Q&A section, because it lets some frustrated citizens let a bit of steam off, while at the same time they are not necessarily critical of the state, but they are critical of other citizens. The analysis also revealed a bias towards non-Slavic merchants. At one point, Hrushi Protiv, the PG Against group, even launched a campaign to forbid people from the Caucasus and Central Asian republics from working in retail, making a direct link between being an ethnic minority and being an unscrupulous merchant. Having looked at the media products produced by vigilantes, I considered the role of traditional media in rendering digital vigilantism meaningful, and analyzed reports in major broadcasters that are sponsored by the state, and also a broadcaster that is independent. Some of the findings reveal that broadcasters refer to the group as activists, public movement, organization, project, however, also as a scandalous organization, NGO, concerned citizens, and fighters. Reports, and I particularly zoomed in on the group Stop a Douchebag, reports culminated in 2016, arguably because this is the year when the most scandalous cases took place, such as, for instance, an attack on a famous athlete in Russia, a 4-time Olympic champion. And arguably, by attacking the champion, the group essentially made an attack on Russia's pride. And after that, their relationship with the state has spoiled. So we cannot view it one-dimensionally. It's not always endorsement. The content analysis also revealed a bias towards female drivers who were referred to as the blondie or a fragile gal or auto lady, a term that had no equivalent use towards male drivers, for instance, auto man or any such terms. Female targets were portrayed as aggressive, scandalous, incompetent, and driving. And targets' personal information was also systematically revealed in the broadcasters' reports, turning traditional media into an agent of sorts, helping spread the message of vigilante groups. I then proceeded to zoom in into the experience of targets, and I did so on the example of labor migrants from Kyrgyzstan working in Russia. Because while working in Russia, they fall target to nationalist groups, but also there is digital vigilantism practiced within the group to which females fall target. So if a male, this group of male Kyrgyz who call themselves the patriots, if they see a female in a public space with somebody outside of the diaspora, a non-Kyrgyz male, they kidnap this female and perform degrading acts. They beat them, sometimes rape them, film the process, and put on and share across social media. In the videos, they ask their targets to reveal their real names and addresses back home. The study revealed that groups and individuals who are vulnerable offline in Russia are also highly vulnerable online. There are layers of vulnerability, and the biases that penetrate the digital domain, they also go back to the offline sphere and create discourse, because as I have noticed, there was no support for females who fell target to vigilantes on the home front, for example. There was the victim blaming. Also, their ability of targets to seek justice is jeopardized. They're afraid of turning to police because of their situation of precarity in the host state. Turning to police can mean blackmailing in the context of Russia or deportation. So having crossed the Russian border, a female labor migrant from Kyrgyzstan is subject to police abuse, retaliation by host state nationalists, but also retaliation performed by own compatriots in migration. Falling victim to citizen retaliation in the host state, labor migrants are reluctant to turn to police. And moreover, they experience additional layers of barrier to justice due to biases back home, victim blaming and shaming. Sometimes when they have revealed their real names and home addresses, they're unable to return to hometown or village because of the pressure and shame. Finally, I consider the environment in which these practices are taking place. Since 2014, user arrests in Russia, social media user arrests, have increased dramatically. So I wanted to see what people get litigation, what types of activity can lead to litigation by the state against users. This analysis revealed that some cases are actually authentic, real cases instigated against real hate speech online. We can ask questions about proportionality of retaliation and the magnitude, of course. Other cases were tactical, made-up cases targeting state critics. There were also practical cases targeting people with limited financial and social capitals so that police could fill their quotas. In this system where the law is quite vague and is applied quite selectively, random people get also arrested for accidental persons sharing photographs of historical events featuring Nazi paraphernalia, for example, can get arrested for propagating fascism. Why is this done? Well, my theory is that, and it was confirmed by some of the interviews I performed, at this point of time, instilling something of an equivalent of a Chinese firewall is technologically and financially impossible in Russia. So instead, fear is used to promote self-censorship. When 1,000 people share the same content, but one person gets arrested or heavily fined, the others will think several times before making such a post. While the system might appear as dysfunctional, it is actually quite beneficial to the ruling elites by virtue of its dysfunctionality, because the unclear rules of the game only contribute towards self-censorship. So some concluding remarks. Russia has a unique history of state-coordinated citizen involvement in matters of everyday justice, and this history is experiencing a renaissance. State-supported vigilante formations are used as a facade to demonstrate some sort of civic engagement in justice matters, while in fact there is an increasing suppression of the public sphere. Those vulnerable offline, women, sexual minorities, ethnic minorities, state critics, are also highly vulnerable online in Russia. While visibility is instrumentalized to harm targets, it can bring certain benefits to participants, financial benefits, social status, sometimes a political career. Traditional media outlets play a role in rendering digital vigilantism meaningful and should be considered in such studies. And amid the intensified control in Russia over extremist speech, the definitions are so vague that virtually anyone can be arrested for practically anything they share or like on social media. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your presentation. And I call now upon Professor Elmer, who holds the Bell Globe Media Research Chair at the Ryerson University in Canada, School of Professional Communication, to start the discussion. Professor Elmer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Sorry, there's a little bit of feedback my end. It's like a garbled version of my own voice, which is actually quite familiar. Anyway, Rashid, wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity to not just read this document, but also to read some of your associated research over the last few years. So the culmination of this in the context of the wider project has been, I think, incredibly impactful. And I've just got a couple areas where I'd like to probe a little bit more before I turn it over to your other committee members. Sorry, the sound is really bad. I'm having to remove my headset here. Okay, so Rashid, I'm wondering to what extent can you still refer to your case studies as acts of vigilantism? There seems to be little in the way, or at least a greatly reduced sense of autonomy or independence of these actors, and what I found, at least, a much more convincing, though, as you admitted, at times kind of implicit relationship with the state and police agencies. So, in other words, there's a blurring here. You've established there's a blurring of a set of relationships, but I think you very forcefully established a clear link to the state. So isn't what you have analyzed and described here more of a hybrid form of policing and state politics?
Highly learned opponent, thank you so much for your question. It's an important one. When this journey started as a team working on the topic, we were considering the terminology that would be used within the project, and vigilantism is not an accidental choice. The very concept has been addressed quite scarcely in the scholarship and with lengthy voids. One of the early takes on the subject were performed by Rosenbaum and Senderberg, who in fact who allowed quite the flexibility and the definition, and even incorporated state criticism, so counter-state acts as a form of vigilantism. The phenomenon was later picked up by Les Johnston in the 1990s, who stressed the autonomy that you mentioned, highly learned opponent, the autonomy of the participants and the importance of being autonomous citizens with no links to the state. However, we see that I would like to challenge that definition, because sometimes this link can be informal. In fact, in Russia, maybe I will give some vivid examples that I was not able to incorporate into the presentation. There are three clusters that I identified. There are the pro-state vigilantes, or state-endorsed. And once again, I would like to state that this relationship with the state is not always smooth. As long as you are not crossing certain boundaries, the state might, when I say the state, I mean the ruling elites, might tolerate your practices. However, once the boundaries are crossed, you can also be done away with. They can, well, as has been the case with Stape Dushbek, a court can rule that your activities are quite illegal, in fact. But there were also criminal groups, neo-Nazi formations, attacking people simply for the way they look, attacking people for their ethnicity, for the language they speak, for their religion. And these groups have also been allowed to freely operate across Russia. Some of the infamous group members or founders, such as, for instance, Maxim Marcinkevich, known as Axe, appeared on national television in Russia as an expert on migration, while he was sharing videos on the internet where migrants are murdered. Some of these murders he claimed, have been staged and are not real. Nevertheless, we see that this relationship is, once again, it's not one-dimensional, it's quite complex. Finally, there are counter-state groups operating in Russia. One of the vivid examples is the FBK, the Anti-Corruption Foundation, led by Alexei Navalny. And we can ask ourselves a question: is this still digital vigilantism, or is this political opposition? Well, let's see how visibility is weaponized in this case. Navalny and his supporters use social media to expose corruption in the state. So in the context where there is no legal entity that could keep the elites accountable, citizens step in, find these acts offensive, and fill the functions of the state. And if we look at the definition of vigilantism, where citizens take on policing duties in the context of absence of state, in this case we can interpret it as such. Yes, it's corruption, the state is quite corrupt, and therefore there is no overarching agency of any kind that could keep these elites accountable. But essentially, when citizens weaponize visibility, they use social media in this case to spread their message and expose the elites. I believe we can qualify it as digital vigilantism. This third example of counter-state vigilantes, I would say, is the most under-researched. It certainly requires further research in the sense that should scholars then look into the specific context? In other words, could FBK, or the Anti-Corruption Foundation, be qualified as a vigilante force only in the context of absence of any similar legal entity, that could keep the elites accountable? In other words, does the political context matter? That's why the studies that are interdisciplinary are quite important. Therefore, I think that digital vigilantism is a term that is quite applicable in this case, and it has been broadened by scholars who are also present in this room or virtually, and it requires further conceptualization still.
Does this answer your question, Professor Elmer?
Yes. Thank you so much, Rashid. I'm not sure how much time I have
only
left.
Very brief, 1 minute.
Very brief. Well, maybe just briefly, Rashid, can you talk a little bit about or quickly, can you talk quickly about the role of your interviews? How did they directly inform your overall argument in your dissertation?
I learned opponent, thank you. Interviews were an important part. On several occasions, I had the chance of traveling to Russia, meeting with participants, meeting with other researchers, meeting with rights defenders, journalists, and other actors. Interviews allowed in some ways to either confirm the findings or to challenge them or expose some nuances that maybe were not considered before. People working on the ground every day, for instance, the contributions of interviews with rights defenders allowed to understand the realities, the nuances of the consequences of retaliation, and then the realities of ability or inability in most cases of seeking justice post factum. I also was able to talk to law enforcement agents in Russia, and that allowed for the state's perspective, to understand the state's perspective on the phenomenon of citizen engagement in justice provision. Interviews are used throughout the dissertation in this exact manner to illustrate, to add on to make some examples vivid.
Well, thank you. Professor Elmer, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. We will continue the opposition by giving the floor to Professor Daucet, School of Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences, Paris, France.
Thank you very much. I want first to congratulate Rashid for his PhD dissertation research, because Rashid, you address a very new, important and difficult research topic, which is digital vigilantism in a specific context, that of contemporary Russia. And your work is an outstanding contribution to the advancement of knowledge and analysis of this topic. You have succeeded in carrying out an exceptional fieldwork on a very delicate subject. Is it okay with the sound? Yes? I would also like to thank you for the beautiful book you sent us and for the pleasure of reading it. For several years, you have been well integrated in international research networks, thanks to your articles and your communication in conferences and seminars. And we had the pleasure to welcome you in Paris. And I am delighted to participate today in your doctoral committee with my colleagues from France to continue the dialogue we have started. I would like to comment briefly your work and to give you one question, and I wanted to come back to one aspect linked with the political sociology of contemporary Russia. I was particularly interested in the first chapter, which gives historical depth to the thesis by discussing the practices of citizen justice and surveillance observed in the USSR. You consider that digital vigilantism partially revives these traditions. You describe the Russian contemporary regime as an autocratic regime, partly in the continuity of Soviet totalitarianism. And concerning digital practices, you even speak of a renaissance of Soviet practices. And I would like to discuss these categories and try to reflect on their further development. What do the practices of digital vigilantism that you perfectly describe tell us about the transformations of governance practices in contemporary Russia since the beginning of the 2000s? What do they tell us about the, let's say, new spirit of authoritarianism that has been developing in Russia for 20 years? We generally face two analytical models. The first model emphasizes the continuity of the current governance with Soviet practices and the authoritarian cultural legacy of the past and of the strong states. But the second model insists on new forms of coercion articulated with neoliberalization of a weak state. So I wanted to discuss through these two models the case of digital digital vigilantism. How can we better understand political governance in contemporary Russia regarding these practices? You give us some answers in your text, but I wanted, if possible, you to elaborate more on this aspect of your work. And I wanted to thank you again for your work, and I hope that we'll have the pleasure and the opportunity to read you in the future and to continue this dialogue in the near future. Thank you.
Learned opponent, thank you so much for your kind words and for your feedback and for posting this question. In 2011, when meeting with his supporters, then President of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, said that no matter what is shared on the internet, we have to tolerate it, because only that can ensure an open and democratic society. In 2021, when meeting with his supporters, Vladimir Putin referred to the internet as a dangerous place where people learn how to use drugs. I'm taking the quote a bit, interpreting it in my own words, not a direct quote, but basically it illustrates the shift, the evolution of the vision towards the digital domain in just 10 years. I would also like us to consider the term post-Sovietism that has been applied in scholarship, some deeming it outdated even. When something is post, it implies a certain destination. The destination has never been clarified, post-Sovietism, but towards what? Towards an open and democratic society by default? Or can the post-Sovietism also imply a return to the familiar old turf, which is exactly what is observed in Russia right now? Having secured full control over traditional media since 2000, since coming to power, Putin and his supporters, the ruling elites in Russia, have also taken measures to take control of the digital domain as a source of alternative narratives. This battle has not been an easy one, as we can see with successful and sometimes non-successful blocking of platforms in Russia, for example. User arrests have exactly been used for the reason of instilling fear in sharing certain narratives online. At the same time, what these examples show is that some citizens are allowed to freely operate, to use YouTube for their practices. Why? Here, I would like to apply the framework developed by Litvinenko and Teufel, German scholars who talked about Russia in the framework of state-critical, leadership-critical, policy-critical, or non-critical publics. I would like to add a fourth dimension here, citizen-critical publics. As long as you are criticizing other citizens, you will be allowed to function. But if you are criticizing the state, and especially this last year has shown that, well, there are absolutely no limits into what state retaliation can imply. People have been physically beaten up and receiving lengthy prison sentences. Amendments to the law also implying that individuals can be referred to as foreign agents for their activity if they challenge the state and if they receive financial support for that from abroad. Definitions are quite vague. This is why I refer to the renaissance of the Soviet era, because what I observe is not a movement forward, but a movement backward to the darkest days of Stalinism, but in the digital domain.
Does this address your question? Answer your question?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have still time for another question?
Yeah, maybe one little tiny minute.
Okay. A very small question. Last one is about your next project, Rashid, because defense of a thesis is a great achievement. It's a culmination of a longer research process. But what would you like to work on in the coming years, let's say?
Hello, Napoleon, thank you so much for this question. Parting ways with the project of 4 years, of course, is difficult, and I would like to continue researching Russia, but also stretching the focus to other post-Soviet contexts, and to consider the role of social media as an enabler of citizen participation, again, considering both the benefits and the harms that come along. I would like to incorporate a dear region to me, Central Asia, for instance, into this focus. It is highly missing in literature, still remaining a sort of terra incognita in academia, and I find it fundamentally important to look at the interesting cases in that region. So thank you so much for allowing me to share this.
Thank you, thank you. Now I would like to invite Dr. Lovelock, Associate Professor at Télécom Paris. The floor is yours.
So, first of all, I'd like to say I'm very happy to be on this committee. I've followed Rashid's already rich research over the past couple of years, and I think it's worth pointing out that this dissertation is very well written, and it makes not only for an interesting but also a pleasant read, and I was impressed by the candidate's command of the English language. Now, the research itself is very strong, and with empirical work on digital vigilantism most welcome, especially in the Russian context, which presents, I think, a number of interesting specificities. The thesis examines how different motives are often tightly interwoven, and this involves moral disciplining, nationalist ideology under the guise of patriotism, but also the perspective of gaining economic and sometimes political capital. Now, one characteristic which I found particularly striking in the forms taken by Russian digital vigilantism, and the ones which are studied here, is the division of labor, in fact, in Russia, with every group its own niche. And Rashid lists different categories of targets: drivers, merchants, smokers, drinkers, Muslims, women, pedophiles, and so on. So there seems to be an arc of behaviors and practices here which are of different intensity, however, and perhaps a form of underlying coherence due to the identity politics at play here. So my question here is, first, considering the fact that digital vigilantism is so wide in scope and involves heterogeneous practices, how can we situate these specifically Russian-bred online practices in comparative perspective? And considering that platform affordances participate in circulating new internationalized norms of citizen-led surveillance and punishment, perhaps encouraging them financially by rewarding the production of conflictual and sometimes violent content. To what extent does this take a different direction depending on the mix of political and media regime? So here I'd also be interested in hearing if you've researched how YouTube responds to these videos, and what are their differences in their policies in terms of their response and moderation in the Russian context compared to other contexts. And a related point is that I was interested in how you said at different times how opposition leader Navalny's Anti-Corruption Foundation also resorted to similar tactics of public denunciation, and this seemed to fit another type of digital vigilantism. And I think it'd be fruitful to compare and to contrast it with the state-endorsed, at least tolerated forms of digital vigilantism you've studied here. I'll stop here so you have enough time to answer these questions. But thanks again and let me congratulate you again for what you have achieved, Rashid.
Hello, Napoleon, thank you so much for your kind words and generous feedback. Let me address the first question. We have, as a team of scholars, because this dissertation is part of a larger project, conducted a comparative study, for instance, on the case of finding offense in bad parking. We did a study in an Anglo-American context, the Chinese context, and compared it with Russian context. And if the cases in Russia and China revealed a sort of class struggle-like attitude where people in luxurious cars are retaliated upon. And when that retaliation takes place, audiences also respond saying, yes, finally, the untouchables are put to justice. If police are afraid to approach these people, then we have vigilantes who are not. This type of class struggle attitudes were not necessarily present in the European or US contexts that were considered in the studies. So it's important to look into these types of nuances, certainly. Although it is important to mention that some topics, some themes appear to be universally present, such as pedophilia, for instance. Pedophile hunters exist across political contexts. Again, we need to look into the role of police. Is there a collaboration with police? Methods, of course, and the ability or inability of restoring your name when you are accused of, for instance, pedophilia. But it's not just the West versus the rest, because of cases have shown, for instance, following in the aftermath of Boston Marathon bombings, when people were invited to turn into sleuths and help the FBI with investigations, racial biases came into surface and culminated in false accusations that led to tragedies in some cases. So that is also observed. Platform affordances are an important topic, and especially the role of platforms that, on the one hand, invite citizens to engage in such activities because it's a business model. You create a video, it attracts millions of views, everyone makes money. At the same time, there is pressure to regulate content. For a while, the situation was rather anarchical. Videos were circulating freely, videos featuring violence. However, with time and pressure applied on platforms, well, YouTube, for instance, now marks some videos produced by vigilantes as 18+. What's also important to point out that some videos that created a counter-narrative, so exposed the vigilantes, were removed from YouTube for copyright reasons. So, of course, platforms play an important role in being a facilitator. Who does a platform choose to mute or to allow to freely function? Moreover, even when content is taken off of one platform, chances are it has already been shared across and it's in people's phones, and deleting it completely is virtually impossible. Although what also has been observed is that powerful people with money and political power can apply pressure on platform to remove content featuring them on the basis of privacy protection. Finally, your point on Anti-Corruption Foundation and Alexei Navalny, I framed this within the conceptualization of organized leaking developed by you as a form of vigilantism. Because these types of watchdog groups in certain contexts, of course, are the only outlet that can generate an alternative narrative, but that can also expose the elites that are doing everything to be invisible in the otherwise transparent dynamic, allegedly, which scholars frame as the kind of a two-sided surveillance, right? Watching from the top, but also bottom-up surveillance.
Thank you. For the sake of time, we continue the opposition. Is that okay?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Favarel Garrigue, research professor at the Center for International Studies, Sciences Po Paris.
Thank you very much. So I'm very happy to be here to take part in this jury. I've been following your work, Rashid, since the beginning, since the first time we met in Paris and discussed your work at that time. So, of course, it's very important for me to see the achievement of this work, and I must say that I am really satisfied with the results. Having worked myself on Russian vigilantism, I can testify that your work is original and relevant. I do not know any other thesis dealing with this topic. and which is surprising because of the popularity of some of the vigilant groups you are talking about, especially Stop Ham. But surprisingly enough, there is no other dissertation on this topic. So this is why I believe that your thesis is a substantial contribution to the analysis of contemporary social transformations in Russia. And you have, of course, all the necessary qualities to reach this goal. Of course, your fluency in Russian and also your digital mastery, which gave you the opportunity to access primary sources about this research topic. For instance, having grown up in Central Asia and speaking Russian has allowed you to have access to the Kyrgyz diaspora and to the harassment Kyrgyz women are subject to in Moscow, which is a unique insight. I would like also to emphasize the quality of the written presentation of the thesis, which is elegantly written in English, and also I would like to say a word about the elegant presentation of the final version of the manuscript, which is a book and probably the most beautiful PhD manuscript I have seen in my life. So my question is about the particularities of digital vigilantism in Russia. If you compared to the development of digital vigilantism in other countries, I think about China, but also the USA and Europe, for instance, with anti-pedophile, for instance, vigilantes in France or here in the Netherlands. So if you were asked about the particularities of digital vigilantism in Russia, what would you answer? How the particular context of the 2010s in Russia has influenced the development of digital vigilantism in this country? And is there a particular form of practicing digital vigilantism in Russia? How would you explain these particularities? Thank you.
Our learned opponent, thank you so much for such a high grade assigned to this thesis. Means a lot hearing this from you. Also, I would like to, using the opportunity, thank Tatiana Zelenskaya once again for the illustrations. She's amazing, a brilliant artist from Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. In comparison to other countries, what's unique in Russia is the negotiation of the ruling elites of their relationship with digitally savvy youth. This relationship begins in the early 2000s with the formation of the movement called Nashi, which translates to as ours. In the press, it has been referred to as Putin's youth, making links to Hitler's youth. So there has been a negotiation of these relations. How can the elites rely on the young people in ensuring regime stability and longevity? That relationship has been a bumpy one over the course of the 2 decades. We also see, or I observed, a certain level of nostalgia when talking to police forces in Moscow, for instance, and asking them, how do you perceive these acts? How would you envision your relationship with vigilantes? Nostalgia came through in these interviews. People were nostalgic for a direct collaboration between the state and citizen agents of the state as a state's extension. Again, some indirect quotes, but paraphrasing, saying that police wish that citizens would form these druzhina-type groups, organized volunteer squads, that could then carry out the tasks that are assigned to them. In other words, little autonomy, nothing that is improvised, but performing justice on behalf of the state, but also upon the orders given by the state. What also sets Russia aside in comparison to other states, unfortunately, is what Vladimir Gelman refers to as bad governance, недостойное правление. Bad governance that has been instilled in the last decades in the country with selective applicability of law, with institutions that are dysfunctional, and with complete suppression of alternative voices.
The position will be continued by Dr. Alenka, Associate Professor at the Department of Media and Communication at our school.
Thank you very much. It is an immense pleasure to be here today in this committee. I would like to congratulate you, Rashid, for the present thesis. It is timely, original, and innovative in its conception, methodological design, and empirical findings. My question today is more of sort of a critical reflection on the issue related to migrants' right to communication. In chapter 5, where you engage substantially with relevant digital surveillance matters and issues that affect the everyday lives and prospects of migrants and their different layers of vulnerability in light of the intersectional paradigm. Also in a chapter, you highlight the opportunities that digital connectivity offers migrants in not only in the process of migrating, but also in their experiences, as well as the associated dangers of technology use for migrants because of unstable information and communication environments. For example, a growing number of studies within the media migration literature suggests that a prolonged digital consumption for vulnerable migrant populations and the related possibilities of generating digital traces might exacerbate vulnerable migrants' vulnerabilities and their existing conditions. So my question, I'm interested in knowing more, how do you envision the long-term impact, the long-term consequences of digital vigilantism on migrants' rights from both perspectives of online communication and self-representation? Thank you.
Well-learned opponent, thank you so much for your feedback, for your compliments, and for posting this question. Of course, in this chapter, I relied on your own work, the work of your colleagues, the works of Melissa Wall and colleagues, and framing precarities that people in migration, refugees, or labor migrants who are forced to leave their home state to seek income, elsewhere face. On the one hand, smart devices, digital media brought about enormous opportunities to stay connected with the family, to wire transfer money, and people leave to make money and to send remittances back. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are the most remittance-dependent countries in the world. And of course, in this case, I used the case study of Kyrgyzstan. In this situation of opportunities, there are also certain precarities, because your phone can make you visible. It can make you visible to police, to hate groups, and sometimes even to dangers that come from your own diaspora when gender biases come into play. If we project on the future will highly depend on what takes place now, of course. If there is no framework, legal framework, or an avenue, a vector, a direction where cases can be taken to, if there is no safe environment provided to people falling target to vigilantes and where they can go and seek justice, then unfortunately these types of violence will be perpetuated until there is that type of change, until there is legal accountability for perpetrators, and until there is an avenue for seeking justice for the victims.
Thank you. Then we will continue the opposition, and I would like to invite Dr. Pridmore, Associate Professor at the Department of Media and Communication at our school.
Thank you. Dear candidate, dear Rashid, thank you for an interesting and engaging dissertation that provides a well-grounded and careful assessment of Russian vigilantism. I concur with my compliments that my colleagues have bestowed upon your work. I did note with great interest something that may not surprise you, that you are very clear in your words when referring to the state, that this dissertation implies a set of actors holding various amounts of power, various amounts of official power and a structure. I appreciate, of course, that your first reference to the state was put in quotations, while I remained many times wondering about the embodiment of the state and those particular actors precisely involved. The acknowledgement of the state in this way was helpful. However, my question is not related to this. It's rather a methodological one. I assume that you may have thought I would ask a question about the state. But you indicate an inductive research process along the lines of a grounded theory-informed approach, and then connect this to a process of clustering, to a Foucauldian discursive analysis. You outline this a bit further in Appendix 1 and 2. And what I would like to understand a bit more clearly is how this traditional coding process, you mentioned open axial and selective coding, reaches theoretical saturation in your studies. That is how you found a clear point in which new data did not inform or add to contribute new insights to what you were seeing. That's the first question. And secondly, how did this then feed into, or not, the more discursive understandings of the text? For instance, in the way you reference Erebus Elian and Walkerdine in terms of methodological guidelines for FDA, Foucauldian discursive analysis process.
Well, Learned Opponent, thank you so much for your question. In fact, I'm really happy that you brought up a methodological one because there was no room for it in the presentation. The grounded theory approach implied that I watched hundreds of hours of YouTube videos, which of course was a nice justification for my wife, doing some research. Jokes aside, this allowed for some findings to emerge that you cannot come up with on top of your head. For instance, the questions were, how are police portrayed? Do they even appear in these videos or not? You can only find that out by watching the videos and allowing the data to inform you. Another finding that emerged from there was the featuring of celebrities in some of the vigilante videos, which also was an unexpected finding. Celebrities coming along on the so-called raids and justifying and endorsing vigilante activities. Of course, someone who is already quite popular in the society has informal powers that can come in handy for the participants. Having performed the 3 levels of analysis, the open coding, the axial, and thematic, allowed me to draw the types of themes that I was looking for in the videos, right? It allowed to see that gender bias, for instance. How are females referred to when they're featured in the videos? Are they even given a voice? Who is given voice in the interviews when a reporter comes to talk about what happened? Most of the time, these were vigilantes, these were participants, again, depriving the targets of an ability to tell their side of the story. However, as further analysis revealed, when the media had a different agenda in mind to portray participants as hooligans, let's say, the situation was exactly reversed. And it was the victims that were given not only the benefit of the doubt, but also the ability to speak.
Look to the opponents and maybe invite one of the opponents to pose one extra question. Professor Elmer, would you like to?
Sure, yeah, I'll jump in here. Rashid, you were talking earlier about the uniqueness of the Russian case study. And you also referred to, which I appreciated in your dissertation, the historical comparison to the Soviet citizen trials. But I wonder if you would agree with me that the racism, the xenophobia, the misogyny that you found in many of these contemporary practices is a departure from that era. Is that something that marks these vigilante practices as something novel or new? That's not something we really got into this morning yet. So I'd like to hear more about the role of racism as a particularity in the case study that you're offering us this morning.
Hi, Learned Opponent. Thank you for bringing this issue up. When looking at these historical cases, of course, we need to keep in mind that in spite of the official ideology of the friendship of the peoples, Дружба народов in Russian, the peoples that made up the Soviet Union were in fact divided based on the sometimes illusionally constructed ethnic marks. A prime example is the deportation of Crimean Tatars by Stalin, where every single Crimean Tatar was put on a cargo train and shipped as cargo to Central Asia, unloaded there to make a life, to build cities from scratch. what we also observe nowadays in the reincarnation of conventional vigilantism in its digital manifestation might resemble something that the father, you brought in Marx, I would like to bring in Vladimir Lenin, the father of the Bolshevik Revolution. In fact, if we read some of his works, he had a vision for what he referred to as socialist democracy. He had a vision that at one point police would wither away. There would be no need for police because citizens watching each other would be just enough. In contemporary Russia, some citizens are invited to once again put on the hat of a snitcher and snitch on their colleagues, friends, and sometimes family members. These groups are called cyber guards. Cyber guards monitor the internet for allegedly dangerous content and make reports to police. This group requires further unpacking in literature, but I had a chance to, through my interviews, to understand a bit of the nuances on cyber guards. Members of cyber guards are young people, usually students, who are equipped with a vest that reads cyber guard on the back, and there is some encouragement, small gifts for you to monitor the internet. For instance, if you report on 100 people, you can receive a mug. If you report on 1,000 people, you receive a watch. So you have these watchful citizens. Yes, maybe they're not looking for people based on. In fact, the role of race is quite interesting here, because on the one hand, yes, they may not be looking for people necessarily based on a particular race who they reveal and report. However, as once again cases show, when people are looking for a suspect after a terrorist attack, the role of the race or religion comes into play quickly. One prime example is the story of Ilyas Nikitin in St. Petersburg, whom people identified as a suspect after the explosion in the metro. Having seen himself on television, Ilyas Nikitin turned himself into police, saying, no, that was not me. However, the damage is so hard to undo. Why he was considered a suspect? Because he was wearing a beard and a skull cap. Now he's still having a hard time taking public transportation or flying because he is not asked to leave the transport by security officers, but by fellow citizens, by other passengers who remember this person as a terrorist, alleged terrorist. Although cyber guards, from what I understood in the study, are sort of a dysfunctional entity, the state, represented by the ruling elites, recruits them for the purpose of self-education. In other words, while you are monitoring dangerous content online, you are also learning what dangerous content might be, and therefore later you avoid engaging with such content.
Thank you so much. And we apparently have time for one more question. So, Professor Doucet, do you have an additional question for the second round?
Yes, thank you so much. Rashid, we have a question regarding the regulation of the internet in Russia by infrastructures. And in the text you send us in the propositions belonging to the thesis, you mention the penetration of algorithms into all spheres of human interaction. And you consider they can intensify power position disparities. So I want to come back to the association between digital vigilantism and algorithmic regulations of the internet in Russia, and how do you see digital vigilantism evolving in a context of technical refinement of online surveillance and increased sovereignization of the Russian internet?
Thank you. The candidate will probably answer the question in another meeting with you. Mr. Candidate, the time allowed for the defense of your thesis is over. The committee will now withdraw to deliberate. Would you please wait here until we return? I adjourn the meeting.
meant with all of us, right?
Yeah, I was waiting for it.
No, one was the last.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. This time you're just hoping. My luggage, when the travel bag was 14 kilos, and I was like, it'd be weird. What is the point? How's the walking going? He was strong. He was in the breaking point of the monster.
Please be seated. I reopen the meeting. Mr. Candidate, the doctorate board of the Erasmus University Rotterdam, represented by me, has considered your thesis. Having heard your defense and the advice of this committee, I grant you the title of doctor. I authorize Professor Janssen to bestow this decree upon you in the customary manner. Please rise.
It's with great pleasure that I undertake the task that Director Magnificus allotted to me by the authority invested by law and according to the decision of the doctorate board of this university. I hereby confer upon you Rashid Faridovich Gabdulhakov the doctorate degree in view of your outstanding work with honors, cum laude. As a testimony and proof thereof, I present you the diploma signed by Director Magnificus, the promoter, co-promoter, and the other members of the committee present here. Having performed this task, I may now take the opportunity to give the floor to my co-promoter, Dr. Trottier, to address you, to be the first to address you as a doctor and to congratulate you on the accomplishments.
So today we recognize your achievements as a scholar. This is an opportunity for our academic community, friends and family, digitally and also physically present, to come together and enjoy some much needed good news. This is all the more fitting given your ability to foster, support, and connect communities. Let me say that it is an honor and a privilege to be among the first to address you by your rightly earned title of doctor. To this we may add the title of assistant professor. Of course, we can't forget the title of esteemed resident of the great Dutch North. It's a pleasure to have you back, even if it's on borrowed time. I first had the pleasure of meeting you when we were filling this vacancy for this PhD position. Of course, your CV stood out among many candidates, and we wanted to get to know you better. We scheduled an interview for you, and of course, this was pre-corona, so the meeting was done via Skype, if you remember that technology, pre-Zoom, pre-Teams. And of course, your enthusiasm was contagious. Your passion and engagement when talking about a project you hadn't even joined yet was remarkable. On paper and online, you had the makings of a great researcher, someone with whom it would be an honor to team up. But what about meeting Rashid in person? We wondered if he would be as engaging physically present as he was on Skype. It didn't take us long for us to find out. You and Natasha took up the long journey to the Netherlands from Central Asia by train. And this was before our department's new environmental travel policy. Now, I'm no geography expert, but this seemed like an arduous journey. And in fact, I remember checking Google Maps, and Google Maps claimed that this was not possible. But of course, Rashid inhabits and traverses a world that goes beyond Google, and I'm going to not make a comment about Bing or Yahoo or any other search engine at the moment. Of course, it may be the case that this most recent voyage from Groningen felt as long as the previous one. Our journeys recently have gotten more localized in many years for many reasons. But that's also allowed you to discover your adopted, and in fact, our adopted home. With your arrival, we came to discover someone so worldly and rooted, someone who can always tell a heartfelt story when recounting events. I remember one day in our departmental kitchen, it crossed my mind, as a supervisor should consider, I wonder how Rashid is doing. I wonder how he's adjusting to this new life. And as I'm contemplating that thought, I hear your voice from either one or possibly two stories below in like these sort of parallel kitchenettes. And from the energy in your voice, I knew I had nothing to worry about. You joined our department as a researcher. This involved bridging cultural contexts, making sense of the present based on historic circumstances, and of course, collecting data. You took on this project with great enthusiasm. Your efforts in carrying out this is a further contribution to our communities and networks, be they in Rotterdam, Groningen, Paris, St. Petersburg, Bishkek, and Tokyo, to name only a few. At the outset, Rashid was also a highly regarded educator, both in lecturing and mentorship. He would flourish in any setting, but we should not overlook the fact that he is an exemplary teacher for IBCOM. As a result, our students see education at its very best, and it changes their outlook on the world and on academic inquiry for the better. Your contributions, of course, go beyond the classroom. I had the pleasure of witnessing and joining in many public engagements, including pub lectures in Oude Noord, and of course, when you would organize evenings on social and political affairs at foreign embassies, from one side of the map to the other. In these 5 years, you've made Rotterdam your home, while keeping your eyes and heart open to many other locations that may also be considered home. I've also come to learn about your artistic endeavors over the years, learning yet another side to someone who is already so engaged in the world. And of course, as has been commented numerous times already, we also see that you're a patron of the arts, having enlisted Tatiana Zelenskaya to produce the excellent works that punctuate your chapters. And this seems very fitting for Rashid, enabling others to flourish through his own work. I've also been lucky to know you as a travel companion. We've had many plans in our early meetings, and as it turns out, through lots of paperwork, lots of visits to various embassies, and a series of mostly good circumstances, we arrived at our destinations. Now, Beijing in 2019 wasn't meant to be, and that's a chapter I suspect that we will be able to explore in another event in this room soon. But we were, the three of us, with Shan, able to share our work and build our networks elsewhere, places such as St. Petersburg, where we were immersed in nostalgic cuisine and culture, the visit to the Winter Palace. And of course, we were there for scholarly reasons as well. Tokyo, celebrating an interdisciplinary set of seminars with some of the best ramen that I think any of us have ever encountered. And of course, Singapore, where we made the most of Scoot Airlines' restrictive policies. Those of us who were there, remember that. I would love one day to welcome you to my hometown of Montreal. I don't know when that's going to happen next, but perhaps the next best thing would be for us to go enjoy some of my local cuisine at a Montreal-style deli in Den Haag. We've had so many wonderful conversations in research meetings. They've been so enriching, and I think back to the three of us, also with Shan, whether we were sitting around in an airport, in a train station, in an ill-fated trip to Moscow, and realize how fortunate I am for these occasions, however fleeting they may be. Times do change, and in very clear ways they change for the better, most notably with Arthur's arrival. Knowing the positive impact you have on any setting, it's very encouraging to think of the world that you and Natasha are building for him. Groningen is very lucky to have you, now officially as an assistant professor. Actually, I'm not sure if it's official. Maybe there's some more paperwork, but we can just call it. I'm sure you're navigating the clash of Rotterdam and Groningen cultures with tact and diplomacy. Your presence is very much missed in Rotterdam, and you're always welcome back. We can always, of course, meet up halfway, roughly, so perhaps something like Amersfoort might be nice in between spots. I think technically Zwolle is closer, but I mean, we know the pull of Amersfoort. So let me conclude by reiterating what an honor it is to discuss your work and accomplishments with the many communities you enrich. I'm very excited for your future, but for today, let's celebrate.
Dr. Kadubhalbov, I have the pleasure also on behalf of the doctorate board of the university to congratulate you on having obtained your doctorate degree. Now I formally declare this meeting closed. So please,